There's been a few reports of people hearing or seeing strange objects or strange happenings in the building.
Jessie King is one of only 8 women in Britain who were hanged, who were identified as baby farmers. She's also the only woman in Scotland to be hanged who's been described as a baby farmer.
Not only was she the last woman to be executed in Edinburgh, but her crime was so heinous.
There was an accomplice who was the driving force behind what she had done. And quite clearly, that was and could only be Pearson.
Jessie is a suggestible, vulnerable adult. Pearson is a controlling, dominating alcoholic.
The sort of adoption for money arranged informally was completely legal and remained so in Scotland up until 1930.
The people in court were totally aghast.
Then, as in now, individuals who are involved in the deaths of children attract a public abhorrence unlike really any other crime.
Every single detail of the case had been splashed in the newspapers, in the streets. It was like wildfire through Edinburgh.
They were out for 4 minutes before coming back with a unanimous guilty verdict.
Most of the staff in this building are amazed if they actually find out that there's actually still bodies in the car park.
The murder of a baby is surely the most abhorrent crime imaginable. When the killer is a woman, society is even more repulsed. In Victorian Edinburgh, one young woman was convicted of just that. But was she a callous serial killer or a vulnerable scapegoat? Should history forgive Jessie King, even if it will never forget her? On the 18th of February 1889, at the High Court in Edinburgh, a shocking trial opened. The defendant was a 27-year-old woman accused of the murders of 3 babies. She was not their mother. She had adopted them by a crude means known as baby farming. But Jessie King had no intention of keeping the babies she had taken in for money.
The trial of Jessie King illustrates the reality of life in the 1800s, particularly for women who became pregnant out with wedlock.
The term baby farmer emerges in 1867 in a series of articles in the British Medical Journal. It is presented as women who are taking these children were doing so with the intent of murdering them in a systematic way. By the end of that year, the term had made its way into the popular press and it became a full-blown media panic.
St Andrew's House is now part of the headquarters for the Scottish Government. In the 19th century, the building was Carlton Jail, the main prison in the city. The public would congregate on Carlton Hill to watch executions. The hanged criminals were buried in unmarked graves close by.
I started having a look to see what I could find out about the conditions in the jail, what actually happened to these people, and if indeed they were actually buried in the car park. And the recent research I've done suggests that there are now 16 people in the car park, Jessie King being one of them.
When the decomposed body of a baby was discovered by young boys playing in an Edinburgh street in October 1888, a horrific tale unfolded. Police were quickly led to an odd, hard-drinking couple who lived near the scene of the discovery. They made an unlikely pairing. So just who was Jessie King? Born around 1861 in the Blackhall area of Glasgow, young Jessie had a troubled adolescence and was poorly educated.
She had a rather unfortunate life because her mother died when she was 18 months old, and her father married again, and her stepmother was very hard on her, cruel to her.
So she was basically a poor girl from the slums. Her father died before she was 18, and then she seemed to ping-pong from institution to institution, prisons.
Her brothers were a good bit older than her, so quite who looked after her is uncertain. So she was very much left to her own devices.
When she was 21, she went to work in Alexandria. She worked in the mills in Bon Hill. And the next we hear of Jessie is that she's in a Magdalene Hospital in Edinburgh.
The first Magdalene institution opened in Scotland in Edinburgh in 1797. Some years later, a second one was established in Glasgow.
The purpose of these institutions were to reform fallen women and to train them to work as servants or laundresses. At the same time, to absorb kind of respectable middle-class values and put them back on the road to righteousness as the people running these homes would see it.
She later returned to Glasgow, and it's suspected that she spent 4 months in jail in Glasgow for concealment of pregnancy.
Under legislation at the time, concealment of pregnancy was illegal.
And this arose from the fact, of course, there wasn't any legal access to abortion, and there was a concern that following the concealment of a pregnancy, that a woman would then dispose of the baby when born without disclosing its existence to anyone. Hence, concealment of pregnancy itself was a crime, and a serious crime.
Vulnerable, uneducated and penniless, the young Jessie struggled to survive. She appeared willing to do whatever was asked of her by anyone she saw as a figure of authority. One man was ready to take full advantage of that.
She ended up in Edinburgh, where she got a job in a laundry. And where she got her lodgings was in a house where there was also a Thomas Pearson and his wife. Strangely enough, Pearson himself, he was from Glasgow as well. And he was from a very respectable family, but they took nothing to do with him because he was apparently very far from being respectable.
Thomas Pearson worked his way up and then drank his way down. He abandoned his wife and his large family, who were clawing their way up to lower middle-class respectability, sons becoming things like merchants' clerks, and he drank himself down into the pits.
Now, Pearson's partner at that time soon died in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary.
And it was suspected that he had given her a bad beating, but there was no evidence to convict him of that.
Jessie was in a relationship with a man called David Calder, by whom she was pregnant. It's reported that Calder had offered to marry Jessie.
Now, instead of that occurring, which perhaps would have saved not only Jessie's life, but provided some stability and happiness to her, she got in tow with Pearson.
And here we start to see what a piece of work Thomas Pearson is. Jessie's come round to help in the house, and while she's there, and she's heavily pregnant, she's in about her 9th month of pregnancy to a chap called Calder, Pearson seduces her. He seduces her while his mistress is lying there. It's the night before her funeral. It's a fatal meeting for Jessie.
Not long after they met, they were living together in poor lodgings in Edinburgh. Lack of sanitation and severe overcrowding made for a difficult life. Tenements were jam-packed, and cohabiting was far more common than it is now. Thomas Pearson was 59. Jessie was aged around 26 when they met.
So that huge age gap between Thomas and Jessie suggests, I mean, it's 30 years, suggests that he probably had a great deal of control and power over her.
They drifted around the city from one lodging to another. In June, Jessie gave birth to the daughter of her former lover.
Pearson pretended to be her uncle to get aliment for the child and got Jessie to break up with this chap called Calder.
A month or so earlier, a poor wire worker gave birth to a boy out of wedlock. The child was named Walter. At the time, illegitimacy levels in Scotland were around 10% higher than in England or the rest of Europe.
In those days, it was common practice for children whose mothers were unmarried to be adopted. And advertisements would be placed in the newspapers for people to adopt them. And they would be given a sum of money to take the children away.
Women who had illegitimate children often had them taken off them by the authorities. Official boarding out or guardianship was pretty common, and they would have to contribute to the upkeep of the child. So that was one way. Another was, of course, what's sometimes referred to as baby farming.
Walter Campbell's mother, Elizabeth, died 7 days after his birth.
His father was called David Findlay, and the aunt asked David Findlay if he would pay aliment for the boy to maintain him, and that she would keep him. And this he refused to do, and he placed an ad in one of the papers looking for people to adopt the boy.
Newspapers like the Glasgow Herald and the Scotsman would all carry advertisements. They would typically be about 2 lines long and then would have a PO box or an instruction to meet in a certain place to conclude the deal. Quite often the mother would want to preserve a degree of secrecy, and in many cases requested that she never hear or see from the child again.
Adverts such as the one placed by Walter Campbell's father tended to attract 20 to 30 replies. The child would be handed over to the selected adoptive parent, along with a lump sum.
The sums of money involved would equate roughly to £120 being paid by the biological parent in current day.
Generally, you would pick the people who said they would do it for the least amount of money. Well, he picked Jessie and Pearson, who had advertised under the fake name of Stuart that they would take the baby for £5.
In Victorian Britain, an unwanted pregnancy was by no means easy to deal with. But if Jessie and her older lover had indeed adopted little Walter Campbell in exchange for cash, they were by no means the only ones involved in such a practice.
It is important to emphasise how few other options these women would have had.
There was undoubtedly a number of women who died going through the process of, we call it a backstreet abortion, but more than likely it would be a local woman in the community that was known either to provide an abortivation or perhaps who could provide an abortion, but undoubtedly things would go wrong.
Beyond the workhouse, there's absolutely no provision for these women to continue working and to look after their own children. The welfare policies in this country at this time seem to be designed to punish these women for the sin of giving birth outside of marriage.
As well as the poor conditions the pair lived in, Jessie could not have appeared a less suitable mother.
Several witnesses noted that Jessie had been the worse for drink or that she drank. Now, this absolutely destroyed your reputation in Victorian terms. Women, particularly lower class women, were not meant to drink at all. If you were seen drinking publicly, then you were a woman of very ill repute.
Little Walter Campbell was approximately 1 month older than Jessie's daughter, Grace. It seems that neither of the babies stood a chance.
The fact that Jessie was pregnant at the time would at least have theoretically allowed her to wet nurse the other baby, because of course at that time there wasn't any formula milk available. However, the evidence suggests that both the money that was received by Jessie and Pearson and their time was solely spent on drinking, and that really no care was given to either of these young children.
And thus poor Walter Campbell was consigned to Jessie and Thomas, and they were told not to tell the mother's family where the baby was, so the baby had no chance of being rescued.
Two young children, two babies in essence, would be a handful for any parents, but parents who were as incapable as Pearson and Jessie were to properly care and nourish the children, and certainly people who had the drinking habits that all evidence shows that Jessie and Pearson shared, would have struggled dreadfully.
Thomas didn't work as far as we can make out, at least not very much. He would have been dependent on the earnings that Jessie could make.
It's on record that Jessie's daughter, Grace, was vaccinated in September 1887. After that, there was no trace of the child.
Baby Grace doesn't last for very long. She's born in May 1887 and then she just vanishes. I think, she maybe lives for a couple of months and that's it. So something happened to that baby and her death was not properly reported.
The Chief Constable of Edinburgh carried out an investigation between 1888 and 1889. He found that 219 women in the city had offered to adopt for money in that year alone.
So the sheer number of women offering this service would be kind of quite big in a city like Edinburgh. In the Jessie King case, it seems that she was selected almost solely on the basis that she was the cheapest.
Jessie's baby daughter Grace was never seen again. By November 1887, Walter Campbell had also disappeared. The couple told neighbours that the little boy had been returned to an aunt in his family. Then, another newspaper advert caught their eye. Sandy Gunn was a twin born to an unmarried domestic servant. The circumstances of his removal from his mother remain unclear, but in court, a neighbour of the couple said that on the 5th of April 1888, she saw Jessie bring home a male child aged about 1 year.
I always remember the description of him as strong for a twin. To have twins in Victorian times and to have them survive, you're doing very well for that.
Jessie told the neighbour who saw her carrying Sandy into their flat in Anne's Court that he was the son of Pearson's brother. She said his mother was too ill to look after him and that she and Pearson were taking care of him temporarily.
He's said to have been a troublesome child for Jessie and Pearson. However, given their lifestyle and what we now know had already taken place, it's not surprising they would find any child troublesome. But indeed, the neighbours were aware of that.
There was a little girl, a neighbour's daughter, who used to come and look after him during the day because Jessie had gone back to work.
For a young girl to be looking after a child in this way would not necessarily be unusual, especially in cases where a child's mother worked, that the older siblings would often be used to provide childcare whilst the mother was out of the house. So it seemed like an enormous responsibility for this little girl, but it would be one that children of this era in Edinburgh would be expected to carry out.
Schoolgirl Janet Burney looked after Sandy every day from 10 in the morning till 6 at night.
One day she came as usual and Sandy was gone and Pearson was there, and she asked Pearson, "Where's Sandy?" I said, "Oh, he's gone away across the water for the good of his health."
No adults intervened, and the authorities seemed to have no interest in what went on behind closed doors once a child had been adopted for money.
There's strong pressure to avoid subjecting what is thought to be a private business arrangement to the scrutiny of the state. A number of groups resist this, including some early feminist groups. They feel that it would restrict the ability of poor women to earn their living.
In 1871, an Act of Parliament had been passed that required women who took on more than one child over the age of 12 months simultaneously to register the details with the local authorities. But there were few formal inspections carried out, so the Act rapidly became null and void. As well as the various surnames used by Jessie and Pearson as they moved around the city, they were often extremely vague about the nature of their relationship.
At times, Pearson would say he was Jessie's father, which of course was totally believable. Pearson was 59 and Jessie was a girl of 27. At other times, they would introduce themselves as uncle and niece, and on some occasions would present as the cohabiting couple that they were.
Sandy Gunn was with them long enough to require babysitting from some of the local children, so they had a chance to sort of see how they tended to Sandy. Thomas Pearson was more affectionate to Sandy, Jessie not so, but they gave poor Sandy whiskey and water. This seems to have been Jessie's child-rearing technique. Give the baby whiskey to shut it up.
Things like whiskey and drugs that are available over the counter in chemists to subdue children, that in itself would not be seen as an act of poisoning a child or anything like that, that alcohol and drugs were used to kind of subdue children during this period.
Pearson and King were now in the process of moving to new lodgings in Stockbridge, these days a highly desirable part of Edinburgh, and there were dark secrets about to move there with them.
Jessie and Thomas moved from Anscourt and they moved to Chain Street, and it's likely they took Sandy Gunn's body with them through the house move. It would have had to have been carefully packaged to do that.
By September of the following year, the couple had taken in another baby. Once again, Violet Tomlinson was the child of a poor domestic worker. Jessie was given £2 to take Violet off her hands. She took the little girl back to the Chain Street flat and fed her whiskey, in her own words, to keep her quiet.
In August 1888, a young woman by the name of Alice Tomlinson, who was a domestic servant, gave birth to a baby girl whom she named Violet. Alice was unable to keep Violet because the baby was illegitimate. Alice couldn't afford to bring up the baby without working.
And Alice's mum, Jemima, advertised the baby in the press. Again, she got sort of about 28, 29 replies to the advert, and this time it was Jessie who turned up with a cock and bull story about her sister being married to the Duke of Montrose's piper, and they would take the baby to live on an estate, and she only needed £2 to take away the baby.
Pearson, according to him, knew nothing about the boy being killed, and he knew nothing about Violet Tomlinson at all.
Violet lived at the most probably for 1 month following her birth and was killed by Jessie in September 1888.
Astonishingly, if Jessie killed little Violet in September 1888, she did so while 8 months pregnant. She gave birth to a son, believed to be Pearson's child, not long after she is thought to have disposed of Violet's remains. But Jessie's carelessness was about to catch up with her. One afternoon in October 1888, a young boy was playing with friends on Chain Street. They had made a makeshift football from a bundle of oilskin.
We laddies being nosy, they wonder what is in the parcel. And when they open up this parcel, which has been made from an oilskin coat and cloth and newspaper, in the middle of the parcel is a dead baby. It's the body of Sandy Gunn.
The boys ran to find a policeman. With the gruesome discovery just yards from Jessie's door, she was questioned immediately.
So the police came to see her, and the police officer said, well, I need the key to open that cupboard, and she point blank refused. She wouldn't give him the key, but he hunted, and he found the key, and he went to open the press, and when he did that, she started shouting, get a cab, it's in there, I did it.
It's the body of 6-week-old Violet Tomlinson, who is the latest casualty of the Thomas and Jessie baby farming experience.
Violet's remains were found on a shelf in a cupboard. The officer removed the corpse and took it, with Jessie, to the local police office. When he resumed his search, he found pieces of cloth similar to that wrapped around the package the young lads had found, as well as marks corresponding to the body of Sandy Gunn.
And by Jessie's confession, he was killed by her, strangling him, causing him to suffocate, and she then hid his body in a cupboard in the house.
It then came to light that the oilskin used to wrap the baby's corpse was Thomas Pearson's jacket.
She keeps them out of it altogether and says he had nothing to do with it.
The local officer for the poor arrived on the scene to caution Jessie. He warned her in no uncertain terms that any kind of confession would be enough to have her hanged.
Jessie didn't listen. Jessie gave a confession which exonerated Thomas. Thomas was never in the house when she was doing away with the babies. Thomas never knew anything about what happened to the babies except various lies she supposedly told him, which made him nice and happy.
The trial process at that time prohibited an accused person from giving evidence on their own behalf, and therefore any declaration made before the sheriff was extremely important, because it was in essence the only time that the accused person could make a statement, could explain, could mitigate, or deny, in fact, that they were responsible.
Pearson also was arrested, so although not at the same time as Jessie, and he also appeared before the sheriff and made his declaration. And his declaration relating to Sandy Gown ties in with Jessie's declaration, as does his evidence in court.
It took Jessie no time at all to admit that she had murdered the children. She would not have a word said against Pearson.
A decision was made that charges would be dropped against Pearson. And instead of Pearson appearing on the indictment, which is the charge sheet, along with Jessie, he was instead to give what's known as Queen's evidence.
Jessie was taken to Carlton Jail, at one time a bridewell where tramps and vagrants were put to work. By Jessie's day, it was an overcrowded prison.
The jail was opened in 1814. The bridewell was amended and the jail was put on top of it basically, and it was made bigger, and it became the main jail for Edinburgh. It housed lots of different criminals, political activists, and as the main jail for Edinburgh, it was a place of execution for people who had committed murder.
Although she was still allowed to see her own baby son Thomas in the jail, it was a grim existence for Jessie. We can only imagine how a woman who admitted to killing children might have been treated.
The prisoners weren't allowed to speak. They weren't allowed to talk to anybody. If they were seen talking, they were punished. There was no sanitation in the jail. It was buckets. In the summer, it would get hot in the jail. It would be pretty smelly, disgusting, unsanitary conditions that we're living in.
When Jessie received word in prison that the charges against Pearson had been dropped, she was delighted and asked her counsel if she could then withdraw her confession. However, of course, it was too late.
Her trial was due to start on the 7th of February 1889, but was postponed till the 18th due to the illness of several witnesses. When it finally started, it lasted just one day. It was the first trial attended by renowned Scots legal historian William Roughhead. In his detailed account of what happened, he described Jessie in the dock as mean, shabbily sinister, like a cornered rat.
I think Jessie would have presented as quite a tragic figure in that dock. But of course, as is always the case in women who have any hand at all in the death of children, they're also seen to be perhaps even beyond evil.
I mean, Jessie was given no mercy, either, in the press coverage, even in the drawings that depicted her. She was portrayed, as ravaged wretch, rat-like creature. Instead of the 27-year-old or young woman that she was, who was vulnerable, perhaps had a mental health problem.
But was Jessie King fit to plead in the first place? Following her conviction, people who had known her before she met Pearson spoke of her weakness of mind. Some were quoted as describing Jessie as not all there.
But in addition to that, Jessie had been treated for VD, and the treatment at that time was with mercury. And mercury had an impact on individuals' mental state, and prolonged use would certainly produce insanity.
Post-mortems revealed that both Violet and Sandy had been strangled using a ligature, such as an apron string. Under cross-examination, however, doctors admitted that the precise cause of death could not be determined, since the corpses were so badly decomposed. Because King had confessed and insisted Pearson was innocent, he was called only as a witness. In the dock, he was cool and confident. His brief but detailed testimony would be Jessie's undoing.
He does nothing but blame Jessie, proclaim his innocence, indeed his ignorance of what went on. That is just beyond belief.
She took all the blame upon herself, and he also managed to turn Queen's evidence. He was allowed immunity from prosecution for being a Crown witness. So Thomas was also able to see everything in Jessie's confessions because they were leaked to the press.
A number of factors suggested that Pearson was not telling the truth when he turned Queen's evidence.
Firstly, when the police searched the house at Stockbridge, the remains of Violet Tomlinson were found on a shelf that Jessie would have been unable to reach. Indeed, only Pearson could have reached that shelf. And therefore, the account that the death and disposal of Violet involved only Jessie and Pearson was not involved is not supported by the evidence.
As for the first child known to have been taken in by the pair, Walter Campbell, no evidence of his body was ever traced, and the Crown could not proceed with any charges.
Baby Walter vanished. His body was never found, and that was perhaps why the charges were dropped eventually.
There is evidence that either Grace or Walter were buried under the floorboards in one of the residences occupied by Jessie and Pearson. However, the reasons for no burial and for the remains continuing to be with them may have been down to just the opportunity not arising.
At the end of the day, you had all the evidence for the prosecution case, and there was no defence evidence led at all. The only evidence on Jessie's behalf was her own declaration made before the sheriff, and what that did was to incriminate her.
The reality of Jessie's situation did not take long to hit her. She attempted suicide twice while waiting her fate in jail.
Using any item that she could find, including the hem of her prison dress, to attempt to create her own gallows, indeed to hang herself. There was also concern over baby Thomas, and for a while he was removed from her care.
There's descriptions of her actually being in the exercise yard, sitting by herself. If anybody asked her to do anything, she would immediately do it. She didn't cause any trouble when she was in jail. She was very quiet, solitary figure.
The defence advocate collected or organised a collection of reports from people who had known Jessie over the years in all the various homes and hospitals she'd been in. And it's clear that she was somebody who needed emotional comfort, because if there was somebody who was kindly to her and that person happened to check her for something, then she would take it very, very badly. So badly she would sit outside in the rain all day.
It wasn't a choice of these young women to go into these institutions. And indeed, they were very harsh environments where there was a belief that long hours of hard work may assist to morally rehabilitate the individual.
Jessie was interviewed for 4 hours by mental health experts who also spoke to prison officials. They presented the report to the Secretary for Scotland, indicating that she did display radical defects of a mental nature. Her counsel insisted that she had acted under the influence of another, but the judge held that Jessie had done these things deliberately and of her own free will.
The jury were out for 4 minutes and they convicted her unanimously.
The death sentence had been passed. Jessie was carried moaning loudly back to her cell. In his closing speech, the judge had implored her to repent. But the furore of the trial had stirred up support for her in Edinburgh too. Over 2,000 signatures were gathered for a petition in favour of a reprieve. This moved several of the jurors to approach the organisers of the petition, worried that further investigation should be made into the case. Her mental condition was assessed once more, but she was declared entirely sane. Born into the Roman Catholic faith, Jessie began to take comfort from visits by the prison chaplain, Canon Donlevy, whilst awaiting her execution in Edinburgh's Carlton jail. King confided in Donlevy and told him the truth about what went on. He then took it upon himself to try and save her life.
Canon Donlevy, Jessie's confessor, pointed out that Pearson had undue influence over Jessie. Jessie's quite suggestible. Jessie's quite damaged.
Canon Donlevy was a remarkable man. He wrote a long, detailed letter to try and have a punishment commuted. And in that letter, it seems that she had told him that there was an accomplice who was the driving force behind what she had done. And quite clearly, that was and could only be Pearson.
Subsequently, in that time period between being convicted and being hung, Jessie became very devoutly religious and appeared to have made peace with her God.
There was no reprieve granted. The execution would be carried out by James Berry, a well-known hangman who later wrote about his work.
Each hangman had his own calculations. Mr. Berry published the book after he retired as the executioner, and in his book he's actually got a table of what a person weighed and what that person would be, what height his drop would be from his weight. Now Jessie was very slim, so she didn't need a big drop. It was something like 6 foot 6 inches, the drop that Jessie had to ensure her death.
The night before her execution, Jessie saw her son Thomas for the last time. She then slept from about midnight till 5 o'clock or so in the morning. She went to Mass with Canon Donlevy, had some breakfast, and was then ready to be taken to the gallows.
In an interview he gave later for the press, Berry said that Jessie King was the bravest little woman he had ever seen.
Jessie's execution was done in private. It was normal for an execution, even in the jail, which was meant to be private, for the press to actually witness the execution. But the baillie at the time decided that because it was the first woman that had been hung in many a year, he decided that no press would be allowed to witness the hanging.
That didn't stop several thousand members of the public from appearing outside the prison in the early hours of the 11th of March. At 8 o'clock, when the hanging took place, it was reported that the city came to a standstill. Canon Dunleavy stayed by Jessie's side until the end. It then came to light that with the help of Canon Dunleavy, Jessie had written a full account of the crimes whilst in jail. Immediately after the hanging, the Canon passed this account to the prison governor, who in turn presented it to the Secretary for Scotland. It was never published, but the Edinburgh press got word of King's admission that she carried out the crimes at the instigation and with the encouragement and concurrence of another. Meanwhile, her baby son Thomas had been given to the care of the Catholic Church, not to his father, Thomas Pearson.
We do know that when she was brought up a Roman Catholic, that she seemed to return to the church when she was incarcerated awaiting execution. So it could also indicate that was, how she wanted her child to be brought up, and she couldn't trust Thomas to bring the child up, either in the Catholic faith, or perhaps it was just she didn't trust him to bring up the child, full stop.
It was a miserable end to a short life of hardship, where Jessie appeared to be her own worst enemy at times.
It's possible that Jessie was somebody who needed emotional comfort because she'd lost her mother. She'd never known her mother because her mother died when she was 18 months old. And that might explain why she kept falling pregnant.
Meanwhile, Thomas Pearson walked away from court scot-free.
I don't think justice was done. Thomas Pearson was clearly the person who came up with this scheme. I don't think Jessie could have come up with it on her own. I don't think she could have done that much joined up thinking, to be honest. So Thomas Pearson really should have carried some responsibility for this.
It's my belief that if Jessie King was to be tried for a similar crime today, and what we know about her mental state, her mental impairment, the relationship with Pearson, the controlling and coercive nature of that relationship, that she would certainly have been pleading diminished responsibility to a charge of murder, and that diminished responsibility, if successfully pled, would have resulted in a conviction of culpable homicide rather than murder.
It's quite impossible that Pearson didn't know what was going on. He was party to all the arrangements that were made.
His proclamations on the stand that he had no idea what was happening in conditions where the word privacy doesn't, the concept of privacy doesn't even exist. He clearly knew what was going on and may even had a hand in what was going on and may even have been the dark force behind what was going on.
Although Thomas Pearson had enjoyed brief success as a businessman in Glasgow, his working life began rather differently.
He starts off as a surgeon's servant in Haddington. Now, what might a surgeon's servant be doing? Well, they might have to cope with bits of preserved bodies, stuff from dissections, understanding how to cope with perhaps amputations, amputated limbs, how to dispose of them. So there's an interesting little beginning to his career. Next, he moves to Montrose, and he becomes a night attendant in the Montrose Asylum. So he was learning to deal with people who might be mentally disturbed, who might be vulnerable.
Having given evidence in court, Pearson could never again be charged with anything connected with the crimes. But his freedom was short-lived. Although the courts did not punish him, perhaps someone else did.
After the court, he came back to Glasgow, and he lived for about a year afterwards. But something happened to him, and he was found dead in the street with a big dent in the back of his head.
He's dead of a head injury. He's dead of a fractured skull. Now, the inquest said it was accidental, but I wonder. I mean, elderly alcoholics do fall down, but people who murder babies, I think they might get a crack over the head from somebody. If you stand just off Edinburgh's Royal Mile, you look up to Calton Hill, you'll see St Andrew's House. Now, that was the place of the old Calton jail. You'll still see the little tower that's the governor's house. Well, Jessie's still there. She was buried in the grounds of the prison, and she's now under the car park on the left side of St Andrew's House. So she's still there, and she's a part of Edinburgh's history.
Jessie's the actual only woman to be hung and buried in the grounds of the jail. The rest are all men. A guy who works for me was on the 6th floor. He was doing a patrol at night time when there's only 2 people in the building. The other person's on the ground floor, he's on the 6th floor, and a lady's voice asked him for help, and there's nobody else in the building.